Grief is a patient thief. It doesn't just take the person you love, it steals the small things too. The sound of crickets on a summer night, the taste of coffee in the morning, the simple comfort of a house settling around you. For a year since I buried my Eleanor, my world had been stripped of its color and its song. Silence was my only companion, a heavy blanket I had learned to wear. But the silence that woke me this night was different. It wasn't the familiar, hollow quiet of my own making. This was a stillness that had weight and texture, a deafening hush that pressed in on the walls of the cabin. The crickets had stopped their chirping. The wind, which usually sighed through the pines on the ridge, had held its breath. It was the kind of dead calm that comes just before the world breaks. My first thought, a cold knot in my stomach, was of fire. I rose from my cold bed, the floorboards groaning under my weight, and moved through the darkness of the home we'd built. The main room was empty, moonlight painting silver stripes across the floor, where Eleanor's rocking chair used to sit. The hearth was cold, the embers long dead. Nothing was amiss, yet everything felt wrong. Drawn by an instinct I couldn't name, I pulled on my boots and stepped outside. The air was thick and cool. My gaze swept over the yard, past the well, and settled on the old buckboard wagon near the edge of the property. It stood there, a dark silhouette against the star-dusted sky, but something about its shape was off, a shadow within a shadow. I approached slowly, my footsteps muffled by the dust. As I drew closer, a faint mewling sound reached my ears, impossibly small. It was a sound of new life. A sound I hadn't heard since my sister's boy was born, a sound that had no place in the barren landscape of my life. Peering over the side of the wagon, my breath caught in my throat. Curled in the corner, nestled in the straw like a small, wounded bird, was a woman. She was young, her face pale and gaunt in the moonlight, framed by a mess of dark hair. Her dress was little more than rags. But it wasn't just her. Tucked against her chest, wrapped in a tattered shawl, were two tiny infants, their faces no bigger than my fist. One of them let out another soft cry, a sound of pure, desperate need. The woman's eyes snapped open and met mine. They were wide with a terror so profound it seemed to swallow the moonlight. She flinched, pulling the babies closer as if her own frail body could shield them from the world. I saw the whole of her story in that one look, the desperation, the flight, the fear of a cornered animal. For a moment, I was paralyzed. The sight of a mother with her children was a phantom limb, an ache for a future that had been carved out of me. I saw Eleanor, her belly swollen with the child we never got to meet. The ghost of that hope, of that life, rose up and threatened to choke me. I felt the old, familiar instinct to retreat, to pull the heavy blanket of my solitude back over my head and pretend the world didn't exist. But her eyes held me. They weren't just afraid, they were exhausted, beaten down to the very last ember of a soul. I couldn't speak. Words had become foreign objects in my mouth, useless and heavy. What could I say? Instead, I turned and walked to the well pump. The rhythmic squeak and splash were the first familiar sounds in what felt like an eternity. I filled my own flask with cool, clean water and went back inside the cabin. From the cedar chest at the foot of my bed, I pulled out a heavy quilt, one of the last ones Eleanor had made. The scent of lavender and her, faint but still there, clung to the fabric. I returned to the wagon and placed the flask and the folded quilt on the wooden bed, a foot away from her, a silent offering. Her eyes followed my every move, wide and wary. I gave a short, stiff nod, a gesture that felt both inadequate and overwhelming, then turned away before she could see the cracks forming in my composure. I didn't go back to the house. The thought of its empty rooms was unbearable. Instead, I sought refuge in the barn. The familiar scent of hay and old wood was a small comfort. I sank onto a stool, the rough wood digging into my palms as I leaned forward, my head in my hands. The unnatural stillness of the night was gone, replaced by a new kind of silence, one that was no longer empty. It was filled with the presence of a ghost in my wagon, a stranger and her two children, who had unknowingly trespassed into the quiet graveyard of my heart. I spent the rest of the night in the barn, not sleeping, just listening. The woman in the wagon was a stone dropped into the still, dark pool of my existence, and the ripples were unsettling. Every small sound from the yard, a rustle of straw, a baby's whimper, was a reminder that my solitude had been breached. I had spent a year building walls around my grief, and now a stranger was camped just outside them. The dawn broke thin and gray, bleeding the color from the landscape. A biting cold seeped into the barn, a cold that promised the first hard frost of the season. It was the kind of morning that gnawed at your bones. My first thought was of them, of her, of those two impossibly small children, wrapped in nothing but a tattered shawl and Eleanor's quilt. I forced myself into the routine that had been my anchor for the past year. I went inside, stoked the dead embers in the hearth, and set a pot of coffee to brew over the slow-growing flames. The cabin felt different, its emptiness now a conscious choice rather than a simple fact. As I stood by the window, watching the weak sun fail to warm the frost-silvered fields, a movement caught my eye. It was her. She stood on my porch like a specter summoned by the cold. Her frame so slight she seemed in danger of being carried off by the wind. She held the babies clutched to her chest, the quilt wrapped tight around all three of them. Her face, etched with a desperate exhaustion in the moonlight, now held a mask of weary resolve in the harsh light of day. She didn't knock. She didn't call out. She just stood there, shivering, her gaze fixed on the thin trail of smoke rising from my chimney, a beacon of warmth in a frozen world. Our eyes met through the glass. I saw no plea in hers, only a stark, brutal honesty. She had reached the end of her road. The cold was a more immediate threat than any stranger. My body moved before my mind could object. The memories of Eleanor, the pain, the desire to be left alone, it all fell away in the face of that silent, shivering figure. I walked to the door and pulled it open. The frigid air rushed in, and with it, her. I simply stepped back, holding the door wide, a silent invitation. She hesitated for only a second before crossing the threshold. She moved with a quiet, ghost-like grace, immediately gravitating toward the fledgling warmth of the fire. She sank onto the rag rug before the hearth, never loosening her protective hold on her children. She didn't look at me. Her world had shrunk to the space occupied by her babies and the growing heat from the flames. And so began our fragile cohabitation. Words were a currency we did not trade. Our communication was built from the language of action, a quiet choreography of need and provision. I moved around her, a hulking, silent presence in my own home. I ladled 2 bowls of hot porridge, placing one on the floor beside her. I added more logs to the fire until it crackled with life, pushing the chill back into the corners of the room. I left a stack of clean, dry rags near the hearth without comment. She, in turn, spoke in the same silent tongue. After eating, she expertly tended to the infants, her movements practiced and gentle. When I returned from the wood pile, I found she had taken the poker and coaxed the fire into a more efficient, steady blaze. She had become the keeper of the hearth, the one part of my home I had let grow cold and dark. We existed like 2 planets in a careful, silent orbit, never colliding but always aware of the other's gravitational pull. Days bled into one another. I would leave food on the table, a loaf of bread, a chunk of cheese, a basket of late-season apples, and it would be gone when I returned from my work in the fields. In exchange, the cabin was kept, the floor was swept, the dishes were clean, and the fire never went out. My home, once a tomb echoing with silence, now had a quiet heartbeat. It was the soft murmur of the babies, the rustle of her dress, the gentle crackle of the flames she tended. I still didn't know her name. I had yet to hear her voice. But I knew the rhythm of her breathing as she slept by the fire. I knew the way she tilted her head when one of the babies fussed. A trust, thin and fragile as a spider's thread, was being woven in the vast, silent space between us. It wasn't amending. Not yet. But for the first time in a long year, it felt like something other than breaking. For 2 weeks, our silent arrangement held. The cabin became a world unto itself, governed by the rhythm of the fire, the baby's soft cries, and the unspoken understanding that passed between us. The fragile trust we'd woven was like a pane of glass, clear and clean, but I was always afraid the slightest tremor would shatter it. I was beginning to forget what the crushing weight of pure solitude felt like. The quiet in the house was no longer an absence, it was a presence, a shared space. The tremor came on a crisp autumn afternoon. The air was sharp and clean, and the sun cast long golden shadows across the yard. The babies were asleep inside, and the woman, I still didn't know her name, had stepped onto the porch. I was splitting logs near the barn, the rhythmic thud of the axe, a familiar comfort. I watched her from the corner of my eye. She stood at the edge of the porch, her arms wrapped around herself, her face tilted up to the weak sun. It was the first time I had seen a sliver of peace settle on her features. Then, it vanished. Her body went rigid, the flicker of ease was extinguished, replaced by a stark, animal terror. Her gaze was locked on the high ridge that overlooked my property, the one Eleanor and I used to climb to watch the sunset. I followed her line of sight. At first, I saw nothing but the jagged line of pines against the blue sky. Then, a flicker of movement. A figure, a splinter of black against the horizon, standing perfectly still. A man. He was too far away to make out any features, but his stillness was unnerving. He was watching us. Elusive, eh? The woman made a small, choked sound and scrambled back inside the cabin, the heavy door thudding shut behind her. The sound echoed the sudden slamming of a door in my own heart. I stood frozen for a moment, axe in hand, staring up at the silhouetted figure. He remained for another minute, a silent, ominous sentinel, before turning and disappearing back over the crest of the ridge. When I went back inside, the air was thick with her fear. She was huddled by the hearth again, the babies clutched to her chest, her knuckles white. She was rocking back and forth, a low, desperate motion. The peace was gone, shattered. I didn't ask who the man was. I didn't have the words, and I could see the answer in the raw panic in her eyes. The outside world had found her. It had found us. It wasn't long before it came knocking. 2 days later, a horse and buggy rattled up my path. I recognized it instantly. Beatrice Gable was a woman who treated gossip like a crop to be harvested, and she tended her fields with relentless zeal. She bustled onto my porch, her sharp nose twitching as if she could smell a story in the air. "Arthur," she began, her voice carrying a false note of neighborly concern. "Imagine my surprise, seeing smoke from your chimney so steady these days. Haven't seen that since before." I stood in the doorway, blocking her view of the interior. Beatrice. Her eyes, small and probing, tried to peer around me. "Folks in town are saying they heard unusual sounds from this direction a while back. Crying, like a baby's." The woman was out of sight, but I could feel her presence behind me, a silent, terrified witness. A protective instinct I thought had been buried with Eleanor rose up in me, fierce and unyielding. "I have company," I said, my voice flat. "Company," she savored the word. "Well now, isn't that something? After all this time, anyone I know?" "They needed shelter from the cold," I said, sidestepping the question. "They?" she pressed, her curiosity piqued. "So there's more than one. Arthur Croft. What is going on up here? It's not proper." "What's proper," I said, my voice low and hard, "is my business. Now, if you'll excuse me, the air is getting cold." I closed the door on her sputtering face, the click of the latch sounding unnaturally loud in the silence. I leaned against the wood for a moment, my heart pounding. When I turned, the woman was staring at me from across the room. Her fear was still there, but something new flickered in its depths. Gratitude. Respect. She had seen me stand as a shield between her and the prying world. Later that evening, after the tension had eased, I went to the cedar chest. I rummaged beneath Eleanor's folded linens until my fingers found a small wooden box, carved with her initials. Inside, spools of thread lay like tiny jewels, alongside an assortment of needles, a thimble, and a small pair of scissors. It was her sewing kit. I walked over to the hearth and placed the box on the floor beside her. "Thought this might be of use," I mumbled, the words feeling clumsy in the quiet. Her dress was torn at the shoulder and the blankets she used for the babies were frayed. She looked from the box to my face, her eyes searching mine. Slowly, she reached out and opened the lid. Her fingers brushed reverently over the spools of thread. When she looked up at me again, her expression held the weight of 1,000 unsaid words. In that moment, as she accepted the small, simple gift, I knew we were beginning to mend something far more important than a torn blanket. The sewing kit was a key. It didn't just unlock the small wooden box, it unlocked the silence that had lived between us for weeks. The day after I gave it to her, I came in from the barn to find her mending one of the baby's blankets, her movements deft and sure. The needle, a tiny silver fish, darted in and out of the worn fabric. For the first time, she did not immediately retreat into herself at my presence. She glanced up, a flicker of acknowledgement in her eyes, before returning to her work. The small domestic sound of the thread pulling through cloth began to stitch a new kind of quiet into the fabric of our home, one of purpose, not of absence. That evening, the air in the cabin felt different, charged with a strange potential. The fire cast a warm, dancing light on the rough-hewn walls. The babies were asleep, swaddled tightly in their mended blankets, their tiny chests rising and falling in perfect unison. She sat by the hearth, the sewing kit resting beside her, her hands lying still in her lap. I took the chair opposite her, the one I hadn't used since Eleanor was gone. It felt strange to sit there, to willingly face the empty space that had once been so full. For a long time we just sat, listening to the fire crackle and pop. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was expectant. It was I who broke it. My gaze fell upon the smooth, worn wood of the rocking chair in the corner. "That was my wife's," I said, my voice raspy from disuse. The words felt like stones I dredged up from the bottom of a well. Her name was Eleanor. Saying her name aloud was like opening a window in a sealed room. The memories, the grief, didn't rush out in a torrent. They simply stirred, mixing with the warm air of the cabin. The woman looked up from the fire, her eyes deep and dark in the flickering light. She didn't offer empty condolences or look away in discomfort. She just listened, her stillness an invitation. "We built this place together," I continued, the words coming easier now. "Planted the orchard. Planned to fill this room with children. We lost the first one, before he was even born. She never recovered. Not really. A fever took her last winter." I trailed off, the story ending as abruptly as Eleanor's life had. The pain was still there, a dull, familiar ache in my chest, but speaking it to another living soul seemed to lessen its weight, if only by a fraction. She watched me for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, in a voice that was softer than I could have imagined, she spoke for the first time. "I'm sorry for your loss, Arthur." Hearing her say my name was a quiet shock. It grounded me, pulled me back into the present. Her voice was like her presence, gentle but with an undercurrent of unbreakable strength. "The man on the ridge," I said, the question hanging unspoken between us. A shadow passed over her face. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "His name is Silas Blackwood," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He told me he loved me. My family believed him. He came from money, from influence. He promised them I would be well taken care of." Her gaze drifted to the sleeping infants. "When he found out about the babies, everything changed. He said they were a complication, an inconvenience to his plans. He called them my unfinished business." The cruelty of the words hung in the air, cold and sharp. I saw it all then, the polished promises, the sudden turn, the fear that had driven her into the wilderness with nothing but her children. "He doesn't own you," I said, the words coming out with a force that surprised me. "He believes he does," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. "He believes he owns everything he touches." We sat in the quiet again, but it was a different silence now. It was filled with the ghosts of our pasts, shared and acknowledged. In that shared honesty, I saw a new strength kindle in her eyes. She looked down at her sleeping daughters, her expression shifting from fear to a fierce, quiet determination. "They deserve a name," she said, more to herself than to me. "A name that belongs to them, not to him or his cruelty or my fear." She reached out and gently stroked one tiny cheek. "This one is Faith." Her hand moved to the other. "And this one, Serenity." Faith and Serenity. The names were a prayer, a declaration. It was an act of claiming a future, not just for them, but for herself. In that small, firelit cabin, surrounded by the ghosts of what was lost, Elara Vance, for I was sure now that was her name, was no longer just running from a dark past. She was standing her ground, naming a new beginning. The naming of Faith and Serenity was a turning point. It was as if by giving her children an identity separate from her fear, Elara had reclaimed a piece of her own. A quiet confidence began to take root in her. She started humming softly to the babies, a wordless, gentle tune that wove itself into the sounds of the cabin. She met my gaze more often, and once, when I brought in a pail of fresh milk, she offered me a small, shy smile that felt more warming than the hearth ever could. The glass pane of our trust was thickening, becoming stronger. We were no longer just two survivors sharing a roof. We were two people sharing a life, however strange and unspoken its terms. The peace was shattered by the sound of a horse. It wasn't the tired plodding of a work animal or the rattling approach of a buggy. This was the crisp, confident gait of a fine riding horse, a sound of purpose and wealth that did not belong on my humble track. I was at the chopping block, my back to the path. I didn't need to turn around. I saw the change in Elara, who was standing on the porch shaking out a blanket. Her humming stopped abruptly. The blood drained from her face, and the blanket fell from her limp hands. She became a statue of pure terror, her eyes fixed on the approaching rider. The man from the ridge had come down from his perch. I set the axe down slowly and deliberately, turning to face him. He dismounted with a fluid grace, his tall leather boots gleaming. His clothes were dark and finely tailored, his face handsome and unmarred by labor or worry. He held the reins of his magnificent black horse with an easy authority, every line of his body radiating a chilling confidence. This was Silas Blackwood. His eyes, the color of cold steel, swept over the cabin, the woodpile, and me with a dismissive air. He looked at me as if I were just another fixture of the landscape, an inconvenient stump he might have to navigate around. "I've come for what's mine," he said, his voice smooth and cultured. It was the kind of voice that was used to giving orders and being obeyed without question. I moved to stand between him and the porch, a silent, immovable object. "There's nothing here for you." A flicker of amusement crossed his lips. He tethered his horse to the porch rail, taking his time, enjoying the power of the moment. "This has nothing to do with you, farmer. This is a private matter, a family matter." He finally looked at Elara, but not at her. He looked past her, as if she were a piece of luggage he'd come to collect. "Elara, stop this foolishness. My carriage is waiting at the main road. Gather the children. It's time to settle this unfinished business." The phrase struck the air like a whip. I saw Elara flinch, her shoulders curling inward as if from a physical blow. She looked small, broken, the fragile confidence of the past few days completely erased. He had the power to undo her with just a few words. I felt a hot, unfamiliar rage build in my chest, a desire to wipe that smug certainty from his face. But before I could speak, something shifted. Elara, who had been shrinking back toward the safety of the cabin door, stopped. Her trembling hands clenched into fists at her sides. She lifted her chin, her eyes, still filled with fear, now held a spark of defiance. She was looking directly at Silas, seeing him not as a monster from her past, but as the man standing on her porch. Her porch. "I am not unfinished business," she said. Her voice was not loud. It was quiet, almost fragile, but it cut through the tension with the clarity of a bell. It was the bravest sound I had ever heard. For the first time, Silas looked truly surprised. His polished mask slipped, revealing a flash of raw anger. He had expected a cowering, defeated girl, and instead he was met with a woman. He took a threatening step toward the porch. "You have no say in this," he hissed. "I have arrangements. Your family has been compensated for their troubles. You belong to me." "I belong to myself," she whispered, holding her ground. "And to my daughters. Faith and serenity." Silas's face contorted with contempt. He turned his glare on me. "You filled her head with nonsense. You will regret interfering." He straightened his coat, his composure returning, but his eyes remained cold with menace. "This is not over. I will be back, and I'll have Sheriff Miller with me to enforce my legal claim. We'll see how brave you both are then." With a final, venomous look, he untied his horse, swung into the saddle, and rode away, leaving a thick, poisonous silence in his wake. The fragile peace of our sanctuary was gone, replaced by the chilling promise of his return. The 2 days after Silas's threat were the longest of my life. The air in the cabin grew thin and brittle, and every gust of wind sounded like the hoofbeats of his return. We didn't speak of it, but the fear was a third person in the room with us, a cold shadow sitting by the hearth. Elara's hands were never still, constantly mending, cleaning, or holding her daughters, as if staying in motion could keep the future at bay. I found myself watching the ridge, my axe always near at hand, a useless tool against the kind of threat that was coming. It was late afternoon when they arrived. 2 riders. The lead horse was Silas's magnificent black, and beside him, on a sturdy brown mare, was a man with a silver star pinned to his coat. Sheriff Miller. He was a fair man, as I recalled, but one who held the law in high regard. My heart sank. The law was what Silas was counting on. I met them at the porch steps, planting my feet as if I could root myself to the spot. Elara appeared in the doorway behind me, a silent pillar of support, her face pale, but her eyes resolute. Silas dismounted with a smug, theatrical air. He held a sheaf of papers in his hand like a royal decree. "Sheriff," he said, his voice ringing with false civility, "as I explained, this is a simple matter of a broken contract. This woman, Elara Vance, is bound by a family agreement. I have provided significant financial consideration. She is, for all intents and purposes, my ward. These papers substantiate my claim." Sheriff Miller, a man with a weathered face and tired eyes, looked from the papers to me, then to Elara. "Ma'am, is this true?" Before she could answer, Silas cut in. "Her agreement is not required. It is a matter of family debt and obligation. She has caused enough trouble. I've come to take her and her issue home." The way he said issue, as if speaking of livestock, sent a tremor of rage through me. I remained silent, my hands loose at my sides. I had no papers, no legal claim. All I had was the ground beneath my feet. "She's not going anywhere," I said, my voice low and even. Silas laughed, a short, ugly sound. "And who are you to stop me? The law is on my side." He stepped forward, trying to brush past me. I shifted my weight, blocking his path. It was a simple, quiet movement, but it was an undeniable refusal. His polished mask shattered. The fury he'd shown before returned, hot and reckless. "Get out of my way, you pathetic old man." When I didn't move, he swung. His fist connected with my jaw, a sharp, cracking blow that sent a spray of pain through my skull. My head snapped to the side. I tasted blood. But I did not fall. I did not raise my hands. I simply absorbed the impact, and turned my head back to face him, my eyes steady on his. He stood there, his fists still clenched, breathing heavily, expecting me to fight back, to escalate this into a brawl he was sure he could win. But I offered him nothing but stillness. "You raise your hand and call it strength," I said, my voice clear despite the ache in my jaw. "I stand still and call it love." The words fell into a sudden, profound silence. The sheriff's eyes widened. Silas looked stunned, his violence rendered impotent and childish. In that quiet moment, Elara stepped forward, moving to stand beside me. The fear was gone from her face, replaced by calm, unshakable dignity. She was not inspired by violence, but by the lack of it. She found her voice, not in a scream, but in a steady, measured tone. "Sheriff Miller," she began, her gaze fixed on the lawman. "Those papers speak of contracts and debts. They don't speak of the nights he locked me in my room for disagreeing with him. They don't speak of the way his love turned to ownership the moment I was no longer a perfect prize for him to display. And they certainly don't mention that he wanted me to be rid of my children before they were born, because they would complicate his inheritance." She took a breath, her voice gaining strength. "This man doesn't want a family, he wants property, he wants to win. My daughters and I are not a prize to be won, Sheriff, we are people. And this man," she said, glancing at me, a universe of gratitude in her eyes, "is the first person who has treated us as such." Sheriff Miller looked from Elara's honest, open face to Silas's, which was now contorted with rage and humiliation. He looked at my split lip and my steady stance. He slowly shook his head, folding his arms across his chest. "Mr. Blackwood," he said, his voice heavy with finality, "the law is meant to protect people, not to be used as a leash. I see no one here in need of rescue from this man. I see a woman and her children who have found shelter. There is nothing for me to enforce. You will leave this property, now." Defeated, Silas stared, his face a mask of disbelief. His power, built on paper and intimidation, had crumbled to dust. He snatched the reins of his horse, shot one last look of pure hatred at the three of us, and rode away without another word, a diminished man swallowed by the long evening shadows. The law had not saved us. Truth had. And the quiet strength of standing still. In the quiet aftermath, the world seemed to hold its breath. The dust settled on the path where Silas had made his retreat, and the only sounds were the gentle evening breeze and the soft cooing of the babies from inside the cabin. My jaw throbbed with a dull, persistent ache, a physical reminder of the confrontation. But the pain was a distant thing, overshadowed by a profound, cleansing stillness. Elara stepped off the porch and came to me. She didn't say a word. She simply raised a hand and gently cupped my chin, turning my face to the fading light. Her touch was hesitant, feather-light, but it sent a jolt of warmth through me that had nothing to do with pain. Her eyes, so often filled with fear, now held a deep, clear concern. "Let me see," she whispered, her voice still holding the quiet strength she had found in front of the sheriff. Inside, she had me sit at the table while she boiled water and steeped some herbs from my garden, yarrow and chamomile, things Eleanor had taught me to grow but I'd long since neglected. She cleaned the cut on my lip with a tenderness that felt foreign and achingly familiar. As she worked, her brow furrowed in concentration, I realized this was the first time she had initiated contact, the first time she had tended to me. All this time I had been the provider, the protector. Now, in this small, intimate act, she was mending me. The days that followed were different. The fear was gone, scrubbed clean from the air between us. The silence that returned was not the tense, watchful quiet of before, but a comfortable, easy calm. It was the quiet of shared work, of knowing smiles, of a trust that no longer felt fragile. I watched her with faith and serenity, a tune always on her lips now, and the sight no longer triggered the phantom ache of my own loss. Instead, it filled the empty spaces in the cabin with a gentle, hopeful light. A week later, I had to ride into town for supplies. As I was loading sacks of flour into the wagon, Sheriff Miller sought me out. He tipped his hat, his tired eyes looking a little less weary than before. "Croft," he said, leaning against a post. "Thought you should know. A telegraph came through about your Mr. Blackwood. Turns out he's not just a bully, he's a wanted man, a fraud. Been leaving a trail of bad debts and broken promises clear across 3 states. He won't be coming back to bother you folks. He's got bigger problems now." A final weight I didn't even know I was still carrying lifted from my shoulders. It was over. Truly over. When I returned to the cabin, I found Elara by the stream, dipping the baby's feet in the cool water. I told her the news simply, directly. She didn't cry out or celebrate. She just closed her eyes, and a single tear traced a path down her cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness, but of release. She took a deep, shuddering breath, like a diver surfacing after being held under for far too long. The ghost of Silas Blackwood had finally been exorcised. That evening, I took a smooth, pale piece of pine I'd been saving and my sharpest whittling knife. I sat by the fire, the familiar motions calming my heart. Slowly, carefully, I began to carve. I wasn't just cutting into wood, I was making a statement, engraving a truth into the very structure of my home. Letter by letter, I carved their names, faith and serenity. When I was finished, I nailed the small wooden plaque to the mantelpiece, right over the heart of the hearth Elara now tended. She watched me, her hands clasped before her. She traced the carved letters with her eyes, her lips silently forming the names. I turned to face her, the warmth of the fire at my back. "Elara," I began, my own name for her finally spoken aloud. "I want you to stay." I saw a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes, and I hurried to explain. "Not because you need a place to hide, not anymore. And not because you need rescuing." I took a breath, finding the right words. "I want you to stay because this house is no longer just a shelter. It's a home again, because you're in it. I'm better with you in it. We can build a life here, a real one. Together, if that's a life you would choose." She looked from the plaque, to the sleeping babies, and then to me. Her eyes were shining with unshed tears, but these were not tears of sorrow or relief. They were tears of joy. She stepped toward me, closing the small space between us. She rose on her toes and pressed her lips to mine. It was a quiet, reverent kiss, a promise, an acceptance, and a beginning. It tasted of hope. We were married on a Tuesday. There was no grand ceremony, no crowd of well-wishers, no fine clothes or elaborate feast. It was just the 2 of us and the children, standing before the traveling preacher in the cool morning light of the yard. Elara wore a simple cotton dress she had mended and remade herself, and I wore the same sturdy clothes I wore every day. The preacher, a kind man with gentle eyes, spoke of new beginnings and the quiet strength of love found in unlikely places. When he pronounced us man and wife, I didn't have a ring to give her. Instead, I took her hand in mine, a hand that was no longer frail and trembling but strong and capable, and squeezed it. It was a silent vow, a promise of partnership that felt more binding than any band of gold. She smiled at me, a genuine, radiant smile that reached her eyes and lit up her whole face. In that moment, she was not the ghost from the wagon or the fugitive from a dark past. She was my wife, my Elara, the keeper of my hearth and my heart. The narrative of our lives, once written in stark, lonely prose, began to flow with the gentle rhythm of the seasons. The harsh chill of autumn gave way to the deep, quiet sleep of winter, and then, finally, to the tender green shoots of spring. The world outside the cabin bloomed, and with it, so did we. The house, which had once been a monument to my grief, became a living, breathing thing. It was no longer a place of haunting silence, but of sound. The steady rock of Eleanor's chair was no longer an echo of absence, but a comforting rhythm as Elara lulled one of the girls to sleep. The air, once heavy with unspoken sorrow, now carried the scent of baking bread, the sound of Elara's soft humming, and the new delightful gurgles and squeals of our daughters. Faith, ever the determined one, had learned to crawl. She was a tiny explorer, charting the vast territories of the cabin floor, her brow furrowed in concentration as she navigated around table legs and rag rugs. Her small journeys were a constant source of quiet amusement, a reminder that life, no matter how beaten down, always pushes forward. Serenity, true to her name, was the calmer of the two. She was a watcher, her wide, curious eyes taking in the world from the safety of her mother's lap or the warmth of her crib. One afternoon, as I was mending a harness near the fire, she looked right at me. She pointed a tiny, chubby finger, her gaze clear and direct. "Da," she said. The word was small, imperfect, but it struck me with the force of a thunderclap. It was a name I never thought I would hear. It was a future I never thought I would have. I looked over at Elara, who was watching us, her eyes shining. In her gaze, I saw the reflection of my own profound, overwhelming joy. We had done more than just survive. We had built a family from the broken pieces of our former lives. One evening, as the last rays of sunlight painted the sky in shades of rose and gold, I watched Elara standing on the porch. She was not a guest anymore, not a refugee seeking temporary shelter. The way she stood, her posture relaxed and confident, the way her eyes scanned the familiar landscape of our land, she was home. She was no longer a woman living in the shadow of another's memory or in fear of another's cruelty. She had found her own place in the world, right here beside me. She turned and saw me watching. Her smile was easy and full of a love that was as steady and sure as the foundation of the house we stood in. It wasn't a love born from desperation or a need for rescue. It was a love that had grown slowly, patiently, in the quiet spaces between us. It was a love born from the patient mending of two broken hearts, a home newly born from the ashes of what we had lost. And as the crickets began their evening song, a sound I could finally hear again, I knew, with absolute certainty, that my world was once again full of color.